Today we're getting under the hood of Gila Tolub, a mother, daughter, sister, women's advocate, and a French-Israeli strategy and management expert with 2 decades of experience, including 12 years at McKinsey Company, where she co-led the vaccine and health equity practices. She brings deep expertise in systems change, innovation, and trauma-informed approaches across global health and social impact sectors. Following October 7th, Gila served as an interim director of Merhav Marpe, supporting Nova survivors and advising funders on trauma response, work that led her to create ICAR Collective, a platform advancing mental health equity and systems-level resilience in Israel. She holds an MBA from the University of Chicago Booth School of Business and is passionate about mentoring women leaders and strengthening communities through healing and growth. Wow, welcome, Gila.
Thank you so much for having me.
Oh, I'm so excited to be getting under the hood with you today, particularly with your more recent work as season 4 is Women's March for Mental Wellness. And so if it's okay, I'd love to get going.
Thank you.
So, Gila, I ask every woman this question, and I love to hear the answers because your journeys are so unique to yourselves. What was that inflection point in your life that got you into the mental health and wellness space?
So I think to me, the biggest wake-up call was when I was 25 years old, and my best friend was killed in a car accident. She was on a trip with her parents and her brother. She was driving, and both her and her dad passed away on the spot. Her brother and her mother survived. They passed away on my birthday, on my Jewish birthday, which I don't celebrate anymore. I focus on my English birthday. And it was, one of those defining moments that, there's so much despair, but you can only grow after that. And then I did my journey and I recognized a lot of other points in my life when events have shaped, and made me who I am today. But this was the one where it's like, okay, life is short, Gila. You have to use your assets. You have to use the brain you were given. There was a little bit of a feeling of a mission. God gave you a brain that you can use. And I felt at this point that I had not really lived my potential, and it pushed me to do more, to apply to business school, to go to business school, and then to apply to McKinsey and go to McKinsey. And I think this moment really propelled me.
It's interesting, though, how tragedy can lead us and really ignite something within us. So, I think it's also a big deal. Where you came from Israel to the United States to go to business school. Talk a little bit about your journey as.
So actually, I'm French originally. I grew up in Paris, and I was in France until I finished high school. I finished high school quite early. I was, what they call a gifted student. And what it means is I was just really bored and really annoying to my teachers. At the time, we didn't know about ADHD. And so it was just active and sassy. I decided to just skip grades. It was my way of dealing with it. So I worked really hard and I skipped a grade and then I skipped another grade and I finished my baccalaureate. I went to the US to study undergrad. It was a big shift, but to me it made sense to move to the US. I grew up in France in a feeling of anti-Semitism, I would say, all my life. And we could talk about this a bit more, but my parents really taught us that it might not be the right place. France is not very meritocratic when it comes to this. And, they felt like the US, Israel would be better for us. And so it made sense to leave. I met my husband in New York. People said, he's French, you're French, you guys should talk. There was there was a bias in the sample because we were at a Yeshiva University event, so we were already pretty similar. But then, I lived in the US, went back to France, then moved back to the US, to Chicago, and then moved to the US, to Israel. And I think to me, there was a lot of this feeling of homelessness, I would say, of not belonging really anywhere, And coming to Israel was actually, for me, a way coming home. even though it was never my home. But I felt at some point in my life that the homelessness was also in my blood. I felt no one in my family died where they were born, because you're always running from one country to the other. And I wanted my kids to have a choice, to have a home. Of course, they can go study in France and they speak English, French, and Hebrew, and they can go study in the US. But I wanted them to have a home and to stop this generational homelessness, if I may.
I can certainly relate to the sense of not belonging. And so I think that figuring that out, I think with that, you also commented about the intergenerational, the continuing to run from things. And that does
Yes.
a lot on your nervous system. So, how were you feeling at that time? So from a mental health perspective of that feeling, a lack of sense of belonging, what
Yeah.
was the overarching feeling in you?
It was, and look, I think it's a lifelong journey. As you know, I don't think we're always any fully healed ever. So I'm talking in the past, but I'm really talking in the present. I think it's important for all of us to accept the fact that we're all in work in progress, right? You're in your 40s and you still feel like you're 16 some days, right? And so I will say it was a feeling of restlessness for me. And very late in life, I was actually doing a retreat in Thailand, trying to reflect on life, And suddenly, as I was falling asleep, I remembered a dream that I had as a teenager every night. And it was a dream where I'm going upstairs and the stairs disappear every time I step on it. Every time I step on the stairs, they disappear. So I can't slow down. I have to run. And I can only survive if I run, because the steps don't stay for more than a second when I touch it. And I realized the meaning of this dream when I was there in Thailand trying to slow down. And I was like, wow, I'm allowed to slow down. Gila, you don't have to run. But it's a message that I have to remind myself every day.
That is profound because you can interpret those. I'm trying to think of the disintegrating stairs because you keep going and they keep, and I think that that's an interesting thing, slowing down. I'm sure there's other ways you can interpret that, but I think the running for survival strikes me because
Mhm.
again, I think survival puts us in a certain mindset. It's not in a wellness state of mind. It's in a questionable state, that restlessness, that anxious state from your experience of running. And I think it's interesting, and we'll move, of course, on. I'm kind of curious as to how that manifested in you and how you felt about it at the time.
Today I actually speak a lot about that video. I don't know if you've ever seen it, the conscious leadership video about above and below the line.
I did actually.
I,
Yeah, thank you for that
I
one.
love that video. It explains how when you're in this fear, in the survival mode, it's a natural mode, right? It's because we are wired to sense threat. We're wired to survive. It's biology 101, right? But that pulls us into that space of fear, and that space of fear, which is you're in defense mode instead of being in the creative mode. You can't be in creative building optimism if you're staying in that place of fear and survival. You know that quote from Viktor Frankl where he says, between the trigger and the reaction lies your freedom, that choice, your freedom. And then Edith Eger wrote the book on the choice. Like I felt like I had to choose. I
Mm.
had to choose to see things differently, and it's a conscious choice all the time. And of course I fall back into the default, and I have to remind myself, and I am preaching to others, and then I have to preach to myself, right? But it's a work of every day. I don't think it's ever going to be over.
I'm a huge fan of Viktor Frankl, The Meaning of Life, the importance of it. I think it's interesting. at the stage you're in, because I know you have several children, and when we're in and raising families, we're in such a period of doing, and to your point of slowing down, it's kind of harder when you're raising a family and you're working full time and doing all those things. So I think, I applaud you for that. I applaud you for going to Thailand, for doing the retreat, for trying to slow down. As you move through this, and you talked about the conscious leadership video and the story behind that, how has that sort of impacted you? And talk about, take us on the journey to the work you're doing today, because there is obviously they integrate so seamlessly.
When I started at McKinsey, they do ask you, what's your passion? And it was a really huge question for me, because they say, what's your passion? Like, is there any industry that you want to work in? And I didn't feel like I had one. Like, if I looked at, I had done a lot of change management with working with airplanes, and there was always a guy more passionate about airplanes than me, and trains and cars. And, I did a lot of work with supermarkets, and I wasn't that passionate about bringing stuff on the shelf, although it's important. And I said to them, I said, look, for me to be passionate, I need to do something that's not only about the bottom line. It has to have meaning. So either education or public sector, social sector, healthcare. And I said, oh, healthcare. Healthcare, we have a lot of clients. And here are 3 projects in healthcare that you can think about. And at the beginning, I was like, you know what? Even if it's only because all my friends are in the healthcare space, I'll have good dinner conversation, great. But I really am passionate about healthcare. And it was so easy for me to become an expert on the topic because I was reviewing stuff about it. And so I started right away in healthcare. Within healthcare, I did hospitals, pharmacy chains, I did med devices. But what I loved was the intersection between different parts of the value chain, where there's a lot of inefficiencies, a lot of misunderstandings, like explaining to a med device company how a hospital system thinks and why you're not really speaking the exact same language, right, was really fascinating to me. And then 2015, I was working with colleagues on vaccines. We were talking to Policy Shaping Institute and an industry, bioindustry group, and we were talking about the fact that really investments were not going towards vaccines anymore and towards infectious diseases anymore. There were always better places where you could put your money. The viruses and the bacteria didn't get the memo. They continued to do their own thing, right? And then, so we created the vaccines practice at McKinsey, and then COVID came only 4 years later. I was on maternity leave with my 4th, and my husband is telling me all about COVID. And I'm like, dude, we said I'm taking maternity leave. Why are you telling me about work? And he's like, no, it's not work. It's life. I think all of us are going to be, are going to be impacted by COVID. And I came back from mat leave March 1st, 2020. And at that point, I wanted to work on public health, and that's when I started to work on health equity. How do we make sure that we don't only bring vaccines to the developed market, but also to the developing countries? And when I started to work on health equity, it opened the door to thinking about the areas of medicine where we have the least equity. You can guess what they are. Mental health, because the more we learn about the brain, the more we realize we don't know much about the brain. And because the success rates are pretty low, there's very little money going to R&D in psychiatry. Mm-hmm. Women's health, because we have a modern medicine that's very organ by organ, and women have an endocrinologic system that is system-wide. And we are still under investing in the research of the women body and metabolism, et cetera. So these are the 2 areas I've been focusing on since 2020. And, given what we talked about mental health, et cetera, I was fascinated by trauma, by mental health. So I spent a lot of time on this since 2020. I also learned a lot about trauma-informed organizations and how trauma shapes organizations.
I think that's really interesting.
I'll tell you a bit more about
it. To talk about it. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I mean by that is think about a pharma company that brings a product to market, and it's a true story, right? And that product ends up killing people. Now, your entire identity as a pharma company is to help people. And now you brought a product to market that killed people. And it's a huge identity crisis. And you put in place all kinds of defense mechanisms so it doesn't happen again. The same way someone who goes through a trauma creates defense mechanisms to protect him or herself. And over time, those defense mechanisms are no longer needed, but you don't know how to let them go. So for example, someone broke your trust and you don't trust anyone anymore and you can't let go, and that hurts you. You need to learn how to let go of those different, same thing in organizations. And then it creates animosity in the organization because marketing and sales trusted R&D that the product was a good product. And you made me sell a product that killed people. And then lo and behold, you're 10 years later and R&D hasn't come up with a new product because they're stuck and they're scared and they've put in place defense mechanisms and risk management practices, et cetera, that are so high that they will never be able to get another product out if they don't work on that trauma. And there are many, many examples. That's one example. I'm fascinated by how these things live in the organisms, right? And an organization is an organism. And so I was also doing this kind of work. And in the summer of 2023, I decided it was time for me to leave McKinsey and do something else. And that's when I gave my notice. And I used I told my famous last word is I told everyone, I'm not exactly sure what I'll do, but I'll know after the holidays. I'll know after the Jewish holidays. And that's when the war started in Israel.
I think what's really interesting about the commentary around your interest and intrigue around trauma-induced organizations, because thinking of that is thinking kind of systemically. But if you look at it on an individual level, so I'm curious before we move on to after the Jewish holidays, I'd love to understand your thoughts and your experiences with individual-induced trauma, community-induced trauma, and organizations, and then society, because I think that there's an interesting, of course, there's the through line trauma. Talk about, what you've witnessed or experienced or even strategized on that.
I like to start by saying that even on individual trauma, we don't know much. We started researching individual trauma in the 80s, which is like super recent. And at the time, people thought it only affects soldiers. Those soldiers who came back from Vietnam or who come back now, like they have this thing, and people didn't even understand that it can impact anyone that goes through a traumatic event. And since then, we've done a lot of research. We understand even more like adverse childhood events, chronic stress that then can take the shape of trauma. We've done more research on individual. It's important for me to say that the trauma response is very intelligent. You're trying to protect yourself. I'm going to give you a real example. A girl, after October 7th, she was a Nova survivor. She couldn't walk. She was paralyzed from the waist down. And they did a bunch of tests. And the answer in the end was, it's all in your head. There is no reason why you shouldn't be able to walk. So she comes out of the hospital. As you can imagine, it was crazy days. I'm not blaming anyone at the hospital because they were all super busy with a lot of things, right? It's all in your head is a hard sentence. It shouldn't be like this. And what we wanted to explain to her is it's all in your head because your head is amazing. Because your brain, she played dead for so many hours to be able to survive, and so that the terrorists wouldn't find her, that her body helped her by paralyzing her and making it easier for her to play dead. Understanding that trauma response is an intelligent response that allows you to survive is the first step to accepting what's happening to you. And then you think about, am I ready to move on? Now, for this woman, we're in an ongoing state of war. It's not a car accident where I can build a new narrative around, oh, you know what? I was driving too close to the car in front of me. Next time I drive, I'm going to drive further. I'm going to make more distance. Or, I wasn't wearing my seatbelt. Now I'm going to wear. She's still in an ongoing state of war. We're still under existential threat. And, it was too early for her to let go of that defense mechanisms. And no talk therapy, by the way, would work in that place because you're in a disassociative state, right? And so for her, it was all about doing acupuncture, massages. And then at some point she felt a tingle, broke into tears from feeling the tingle in her leg. At that point, talk therapy was an option, and she started walking again. I'm talking about this because I just want to say the first step is to understand that trauma response is a smart response. It's just that after you need to work through it. And so in the collective trauma is being even less studied. One of the experts on collective trauma is Thomas Hubel, who lives here in Tel Aviv, is originally from Austria, but married a woman from Israel, moved to Israel. He did a lot of work on collective trauma, studying what happened in Germany with Nazi descendants and Jewish descendants, and also helping them work, understand one another, because collective trauma stays also unless you work on it. And when you look too much to the past and you're stuck in the past, you're stuck at different places of the past. And then when we're talking to each other, we're not in the present. And it's very hard to build a future together if we can't stand together in the present. So one of the things that Thomas Hubel explains is almost that your ancestral trauma, your collective trauma that you're carrying, means that your train is going at one speed and another train is going at another speed, and we're trying to talk to each other and wave at each other, but really we need to stop at the station to be able to actually talk to one another. And to do that, we need to be in the present, and to do that, and only if we do that can we build a future together. We don't know much about collective trauma, and that's why the war that we're in Israel right now is one of the first time that you have a developed market with such a big national and collective trauma. There are no protocols. We don't have a playbook that says, here's what you need to do when that happens. We're trying to figure it out. And people need to talk to each other, to try things, generate evidence. But that's one of the reason why working together is so important.
It would be great for you to share, what compelled you to, what it's about, and then we'll ask questions from there.
Probably 4 reasons why ICAR. The first one we mentioned, the no protocols. So it's not like we have a playbook and we can go and do it. The second one is a chronic underfunding of mental health globally, but also specifically in Israel. I think the third one is extreme fragmentation of the system in Israel, creating a lot of confusion of who does what, who's responsible for whom, where do I go when I need care, and making it hard for people who want to support Israel to know where to send the money, where to send the mental health professionals. And with all of this, I feel like we could have continued as is. We're not the only countries with these problems of underfunding, fragmentation, and no protocols, and shortages, et cetera, et cetera. But October 7th exposed that mental health crisis in a way. It's not a new crisis, a crisis that existed, that we've seen a glimpse of it in COVID and during the corona, but now it's exposed, and now we don't have a choice. Supply and demand is completely, So we said it's time for collective impact, collective work. ICAR stands for Israel, Collective Action for Resilience. Collective action means every organization that works in the field today of mental health or trauma recovery has its own mission statement, has its own population that it's trying to support, etc. But now we also have an Uber mission, all of us, which is to accelerate the recovery from October 7th. And suddenly we all share that mission statement. Suddenly we also all realize that there isn't enough to, there's no longer a scarcity mindset of, the patients need to come to me because or else the donors won't help me, et cetera, et cetera. Like there's enough for everybody. It's too big for any one of us. We need to work together to be able to overcome this challenge. And so it's the right time for collective impact model. And what do? We map who's doing what. People told us, folks will be suspicious of who you are. Why are you asking all these questions? And the truth is, I was actually surprised by how open people, like everybody understands all those problems I described. For some of them, it's about, help me understand who else is doing what I'm doing. Help me understand where do I send the people that I cannot help. Help me understand how my message can be heard by the people who match my value proposition. Help me understand how to do more effective fundraising because I'm spending too much on fundraising instead of helping the people who need my help. Right? All of these things, and we can help each other by working together. So mapping is one. Second one is introducing people to one another. Now that we know that they exist, I feel like every day I'm a matchmaker. Oh my God, you should talk to so-and-so. He's doing something very similar. Or, you should talk to this professor because, they're working, they want to showcase and research community resilience. And you sitting on so much data in your NGO, like work together to generate evidence. Also, if you don't generate evidence, you can't decrease reliance on philanthropy. And then, get reimbursed or work with it. So it's a win-win, and philanthropists who are also wanting to help, but are worried about hurting, right? Sometimes they say, I don't know, is it a good organization? Is it doing the right thing? And, and you have experts because we have, 3 psychiatrists, 10 opinions. It's like, this is, no, this is not good. Yes, this is good. So then, the philanthropist is going to say, oh, you know what? I'm just going to go help with rebuilding shelters or feeding children. Everybody needs to eat, everybody needs to be protected. Mental health is too complicated. So we're also helping connect people. And then the last thing, we are trying to mix with this bottoms-up view of who's doing what and matching, helping matchmaking. We also try to take a top-down view and ask experts, if you had $100 million, where would you put it? And we got a lot of different answers, but actually we narrowed it down. There were 8 areas that everybody agreed on. And those we call the 8 imperatives, that if we do it right, we can actually accelerate the healing process, not only help it, but actually accelerate it. And none of these can be done by any one organization alone. They require convening, they require collective impact, they require collective efforts. So that's what we're trying to do.
It's amazing the work you're doing and the collective impact that you will have. And I like also the way you described by all these convenings, the accelerating the impact. And so it'll be very curious. I look forward to watching how this is going to unfold and the work you're doing, because it's really, really important work. The other thing that struck me as well is the healing process. You said, if we do this right individually, of course, you're doing it from a business perspective. How would you say you are?
So before I answer that question, I want to react to what you're saying, because one of the things I didn't say about collective trauma versus individual trauma is that collective trauma leads to collective healing, which in a way...
I like that. I like that. I like that a lot. That's good.
We look at each other here and we're all in it, right? And sometimes we forget, but most of the time when you slow down, you realize we're all in it together and we are going to heal together. We got hurt together, we're going to heal together. It also helps with destigmatization, because when you have individual trauma, there's still a bit of stigma, but today there's no more stigma. We all got hurt. And I mean, of course, like, we're still working with people, but the number of people who told me, no one knows I have PTSD from the war like 20 years ago. And now it's like, you could talk about it. So I do think that's the nice part of the collective trauma, is the collective healing.
Yeah, I think that's beautiful. I think that is, you're right. It's just, and I think that today with the loneliness factor,
Exactly.
being that's like an epidemic as well. So if you're suffering from PTSD and you're alone, that's only going to magnify your loneliness.
Exactly. And by the way, like, that's one of the strengths in Israel. We are living in communities. When you look at the numbers in the general population, we have more PTSD than most other countries, because we're a country made on survivors, children who grew up at the border with rockets, etc. When you look at veterans versus veterans, you see that we have less PTSD, because our veterans are surrounded by people who respect them, support them, they're together, and the community aspect, I think, will help us heal. And so what we're trying to think about in the country as well is, how do we build those resilient communities? We don't have to over-medicalize trauma. We don't want to create a pathology out of everybody right now. It's not the point. We're resilient human beings, and 80% of people who face terrible trauma end up fine, right? Because of how resilient we are. And so that's also a very important message, that we need to remember that we're strong and we'll be strong, and continue to fight against the media who tell us we're all post-traumatized, in post-trauma, etc. Now, about my own efforts, like I said, I'm a work in progress. It depends on the day. It depends. At the beginning of the war, when I was working with the survivors of the Nova, someone told me, Gila, I don't understand how you do it. You come every day. And I usually take a day off and a day in, because I need the one day off to a resource. And I don't see you break down. And I say, what do you mean you don't see me break down? I break down about every 90 minutes. I have my little breakdown, a lot of tears and anger. And then I come back at it because I don't have a choice. Like I just go back and I pour myself in work. And in the summit that we had with ICAR, one of our experts was on stage and he says, there's nothing, everybody chooses a poison to cope with what's happening right now. And we're seeing a rise in drug usage, both, legal drugs like Clonex or whatever, or Xanax or whatever, and illegal drugs. But my coping mechanism has been finding meaning in my work and working a lot. And I know that it's that I'm using this as an escape. And sometimes I joke, I tell people my addiction is better than yours because mine is socially accepted, but it doesn't mean it's really better. It means that I escape through a way that's, maybe healthier and maybe not. I need to learn how to slow down. I'm a work in progress. I know that the weeks that I do go to yoga, I'm better than the weeks when I don't go to yoga. I know that the weeks when I sleep not enough, I am way more easily triggered by, rejection or by the feeling of perceived rejection, right?
Mm.
So, it's just about, remaining self-aware and knowing, when you need to take a break. I did, a few weeks ago, I took a mental health day. I was like, guys, not feeling well. I didn't have to explain to everyone what part of my body wasn't feeling well. I just said I'm not feeling well.
But I think what's interesting about that is that when you're doing that work, the mental health work on a collective level, on an individual and a collective level, often the healers themselves, and even if you're doing it from a business perspective, you're not necessarily a psychologist, psychiatrist, but you're doing it. You are living in that trauma space all the time. I think you made the comment about being self-aware, what does it look like? So I think, so you've been doing your ICAR Collective for how long now?
About 9 months, since July 1st. I always tell people we're still a baby. We're barely learning to sit down and hold our head straight. And so that's also about being self-aware. We have big goals and a big vision, but it's step by step. And that's also a work in progress, right? Some days I beat myself up for not doing enough and not being enough. And then realize, dude, like it's been 9 months. It's, you're doing what you can in the time that you have, right? But it's, yeah, we're pretty new. We have grown pretty fast from, a team of 4 co-founders to 11 people working full time on that mapping, on reaching out to all of the mental health organizations in the field to understand who's doing what, trying to build the trust so that we can understand the needs of the field and see what could help. Bringing communities together of people doing similar things that can learn from one another. That's how we see our role as a backbone organization.
Congratulations. In 9 months, you've accomplished so much. I went onto your platform and it's like, wow. I mean, it's really, really impressive the work you're doing. And I just want to ask one last question before I ask the last question, which is, what is your vision? If you could have anything for ICAR Collective, what do you imagine it to be?
I'd like to see more public-private partnerships. So I think we've seen a lot of people raise their hands to help on the private side. And then, the government is also trying to do a lot, but there is a lot of fragmentation, even at the government level. Trauma impacts everything, not just the Minister of Health, right? It impacts the Minister of Welfare and Social Affairs, Minister of Economy, Minister of Defense, obviously, with all the soldiers. And so I'd love to find ways to have more effective public-private partnerships on some of these. And I think organizations are doing it. I'm not saying, I'm just saying we need more. And I think there's a lot that the public sector can learn from the private sector. I think the private sector sometimes is very snob about the public sector, like, oh, they don't know what to do, and it's not true. Like, public sector is full of amazing people as well, right? And it's more about how do we work together to leverage everybody's strength. And the other thing is I wish more people would realize why mental health is so important. We're not doing mental health for the sake of mental health, although it would be worthy anyways, but it's about physical health. We have so much high blood pressure and cardiovascular issues in general, autoimmune diseases. Shingles is all around here right now. It's about productivity, children who can't go to school, or it's about people who are unemployed or have on-the-job accidents. And it's about security, because when your serotonin levels are off and you're aggressive and impulsive, you have more car accident, you have more domestic abuse, it's all of this.
Getting back to it's really heavy stuff, because unpacking trauma in general is hard. But when you look at a country that's going through a war, like real time, things are happening every day.
Yeah.
And you have intergenerational trauma, and you have other types of trauma, as you said, all the domestic, all these different things. It's not like three-dimensional. It's more like five-dimensional. There's so many dimensions to the way to sort of cope and find ways to heal. And also like the desire to want to be a healed country, a healed individual, a healed collective, a healed organization. What type of culture do we want to create? And so,
and can we actually heal when we're still in war? Can we actually heal when there's still hostages that are not home? Can we even let go, right? The feeling of guilt that the hostages that came back are feeling. And it's also a question of knowing what can be done now. It's a lot.
I have one last question. I mean, I could talk to you forever about this. Evoked and provoked a lot of thought in me. But this is your platform today, Gila, to give women a message of all ages, of all backgrounds, of all cultures. What do you want to leave them with?
Something that just popped into my mind. I actually didn't think about it before we spoke, but all the studies about what people regret on their deathbed, right? It's never about that meeting at work that it didn't go to. It's always about doing the right thing, being with your family, etc. And I think it took me a long time, because of what we spoke about, the always running and always wanting to help everyone else, etc., to make space for me, for my family. Life is short. Spending more time with your family and finding meaning in your work, because we spend so much time at work. You and I spoke about this, we spend so much time at work, and sometimes we drink the Kool-Aid and we think what we're doing is, super important. But taking a step back and figuring out, is it really important? Am I doing something that's meaningful, that uses my strength, right? I'm here for something, for a reason. So that's what I would want, people to think about, women of all ages to think about.
Thank you for that. I love that. I think that's a great thing to part with. I'm going to ask, this is the first time I'm asking this, but if people want to find you, where can they find Gila Tolub?
Probably on LinkedIn is the best way to find me. I'm also on Facebook. I'm also on email, and I have a website, but LinkedIn is where I'm most active and love connecting with new people and talking about this. So Gila Tolub, very easy to find me.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, Gila. Thank you so much for such a deep, a rich conversation, for getting under the hood with me today.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Under the Sisterhood. If you haven't already, please give us a quick rating and review on Apple or Spotify. And make sure to follow us on Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, and LinkedIn so you can hear from more amazing women. This podcast is created and hosted by Under the Sisterhood LLC and Elizabeth Elfenbein, produced by Elizabeth Elfenbein and Matt Butler, and edited by Matt Butler. The music is by Ayla Schaefer, her song Rose.